I guess it's great once again to be here in Bush. I was here last April and I promised that I'll be back. I think that at that time, it was just at short notice and I had to come here. But this time, I promised I was coming back more prepared. And today is an opportunity for us to once again discuss the Darfur crisis. I mean, there's been so much headline on this crisis because of the humanitarian challenge that it poses. Although it's a conflict that really disturbs the international peace and security, I would say that basically it's an issue of a humanitarian challenge. The United Nations has called the Darfur crisis the world's worst humanitarian challenge. But before we start, I guess we have to get into the legalities of presentations. I'm currently still employed by the United Nations, and as I stand here, anything that I say does not really represent the official position of the United Nations. Well, today it's an opportunity to once again discuss the Darfur crisis, as I said. We will look at the genesis of the Sudan crisis leading to the formation of UNMISS. That UNMISS is the United Nations mission in Sudan. That is currently the peacekeeping force that is deployed in Sudan. We'll also look at Darfur as an offshoot of the primary crisis because the Darfur crisis as a totality relating into the Darfur as an offshoot of the major crisis. We also looked at the inception of UNMISS, where UNMISS is the African Union mission in Sudan, and its metamorphosis into what we today have in the Darfur. After the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1769, we have a new peacekeeping mission in Darfur called the United Nations African Union mission in the Darfur, the UNAMID. We'll look at the Security Council resolution that generated the UNAMID. We'll look at the mandates, the task that is given to the force. And then look at the progress on deployment of forces, what has happened so far after the Security Council resolution was passed. We'll look at the humanitarian crisis. That is my main effort today because that is what concerns me most. And that's what I want to bring to my peers and people in Vanderbilt. I had the opportunity to be there, and I think that it would be nice of me to also bring it to your notice. We'll all discuss it at the end of the lecture, maybe see how far we can go in trying to alleviate the suffering of the people of the Darfur and maybe totally in the Sudan. I'll look at the challenge, what generates the humanitarian crisis actually. What are the factors that generates the challenge? What have been the efforts so far by the international community, led by efforts from the United Nations? And then I'd like to do an assessment. Maybe together we'll look at whether there is hope for Darfur or there's going to be total doom. Before we launch into this talk, I would like us to look at the dynamics as they develop the Darfur today, relating it to the country Sudan. Its position on the African map, its relations to the world politics, and then the dynamics as it evolves, looking at the surroundings of the country Sudan, a very big country that is almost equal to the size of Western Europe. And then the number of countries that surround Sudan. We have Ethiopia, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Kenya, Uganda, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the Central African Republic, the Chad, we have Libya, and then Egypt. A total of about 9 countries surrounding this one nation. So one needs to understand the dynamics of this conflict situation And most of these countries surrounding Sudan today are also faced with a lot of internal conflicts. We have rebels coming into Sudan, rebels going back into these nations. And then the problem has to relate to refugees, as well as the government in Sudan fighting against the other governments who are trying to harbor rebels that come into Sudan now and then to attack the country. Now, I want you to understand that Sudan currently is divided into the north and the south. We have the south that is fighting for freedom or liberation from the north. Its capital is in Juba. Then we have Darfur, that is the Inferno area. And I've been there for the past 2 years now. Sudan is a very beautiful country, although it's an arid area with a lot of potential for tourism. It's full of beautiful people with a lot of good heart, but they have been faced with almost 3 decades of war. Let's look at the basic facts of Sudan. What strikes me here is that they have a life expectancy of 57 years. I believe a lot of Americans, a lot of developed areas at 57 years, you are still in your prime. Currently, they have hit some oil. Oil too serves as basis for a lot of conflicts because there are a lot of facts that point to the fact that oil in Africa or the third world has been the genesis of a lot of conflict. You can now look at the GNI per capita, $640. A lot of people, I think over 90% of the people in Sudan live on less than $1 a day. Now let's launch into the crisis. The crisis actually is between the north and south, as I said earlier on. The Sudan had its independence in 1956, but before independence, they had already started fighting. People say that this is the first true climate war because currently the Sudan is almost, let me say, 96% arid, it's desert. People believe that these two sides, the north and the south, live together as friends. They cohabited. But as the climatic changes come in and we have a lot of arid land, people now start fighting for grazing pasture and other things. And it's no more whether we're living as neighbors, but it's a matter of survival. So either I get you out of the way for my cattle to graze, or we live together as neighbors. And once we have a lot of changes in the climate conditions, I mean, this war is going to escalate. So the war has been as a result of fight over resources. The South believe that the North has neglected them for so long. We have discrimination. The South have never had a share in the seat of power. And then Sudan is predominantly Islamic. And there's not been the ability to separate religion from statehood. And then, of course, last but not the least, is self-determination, whether the South should still be part of Sudan or they need to secede in order to be able to liberate themselves. Like I said earlier on, the Sudan is a very beautiful country, but it's been a mix of development and neglect. We have this beautiful bridge over the River Nile in Khartoum, the very popular River Nile, so famous in the world. At the same time, there are a lot of high rises in Khartoum because of the oil that they've hit recently. There are a lot of developments that are going on very, very fast. Meanwhile, the South still wallows in poverty. You can see the emptiness in the Darfurs. Vast, vast lands without any infrastructure, no development. At the same time, in the South, we have a lot of neglect. So we can look at the effects of the war. Since 1955, it's believed that over 2 million people have been killed, 4 million have fled their homes, and 600,000 people have fled the country as refugees. The refugees in Sudan have called themselves the forgotten refugees because they believe the international community has not come to their aid as fast as necessary. I want to say that some of the graphics that will come as I look at the effects of the war, some might not be too nice to see, but I guess we need to take them in for us to imbibe what the effects of the war has actually been. So sometimes if the picture that come up on the screen are not too nice to watch, my apologies. This is the militia in Sudan. Of course, the Darfur is full of people displaced. They don't have any homes. This is where a lot of people live in the Sudan, especially in the Darfurs. And children, women, and the aged, those are the most affected people. They don't have the wherewithal or the clout to be able to move around. Those who fight have the energy. They take all the food that come in as relief. But the children, the women, and the aged have nothing to do or nothing to take. And putting a more human side to it, I mean, as students in Owen or in Vanderbilt, we have our condos to ourselves. But this is somebody's condos by Darfur standards. Formation of the United Nations mission in Sudan. I mean, the big picture, we have the United Nations mission in Sudan, that is the UNMISS, which was formulated as a result of United Nations Security Council Resolution 1590 in March 2005. We were authorized to deploy 11,000 troops and police advisors. What was the mandate? What were we supposed to achieve? The North and the South came to an agreement as a comprehensive peace accord that allows for a share of sharing positions or seats in government. So they call it a comprehensive peace accord. And then we were to ensure that there's a voluntary return of refugees and internally placed persons. We were to offer humanitarian assistance as well. Of course, mine action sector assistance. There's a lot of mine that have laid in Darfur, and there's the need for a lot of work to get rid of these mines for people to freely move around the region and to protect and promote human rights in Sudan. If you look at the size of Sudan and the number of places that have been laid with mines, of course, this should not come as a surprise. We have a lot of maimed people, both children, the elderly, and a lot of women. Now we look at the state of attainment of the mandate. How far have we progressed? What have we done so far? We have about 9,000 troops so far deployed instead of 11,000. A lot of countries already have pledged to contribute troops, but it's not all the countries that pledged that have really contributed to the number of troops that we needed. Currently, we have realized that, there was supposed to be withdrawals of troops beyond certain lines. The United Nations has been able to monitor these withdrawals, and there's an observed disengagement and then redeployment behind certain lines as required by the peace accord. Then in 2011, we are expecting to have a referendum that will decide whether the South, that has claimed that they have been neglected for so long by the North, whether they would like to secede or they would still like to remain as part of the total Sudan. But currently, there are a lot of political problems. The government plays to the international community as if they would like this whole process to take place. Meanwhile, at the same time, they would like to have what is the current status. The status quo must be maintained so they can still have the oil money and develop Khartoum, that is the capital, whilst the other regions remain as they are now. So there's a lot of interference in the work of the UN through restriction in flow of logistics and other issues like customs clearance at the ports. All these things hampers movements, and then the task of humanitarian organizations as well as the United Nations in the Sudan. Now, we look at the extension to the Darfur crisis. The Darfur crisis was just an offshoot of the current crisis in the Sudan. After having realized that there was a progress between the North and the South, the Darfurs also realized they could also move forward their case because they believe that they have been neglected also for so long. If the South had an agreement, why can't they also move and get an agreement? So we had rebel movements in Darfur also started struggling with the government. It also generates out of the same pasture land and grazing. The main belligerents have been the Sudanese government, there's a Sudanese liberation movement, and then justice and equality movement, we call it GEM. These are the main belligerents in the Darfur crisis. And we have heard so much in the news about the Janjaweed militia, the government of Sudan using this Arab militia, marauding all over Darfur, looting and raping women. This is the current statistics. It's believed by the United Nations that it's not only 200,000 that have died. We believe that it's between 200 and 400,000 people who have died. The most important thing is that 2.5 million people have been driven out of their homes. And this is the greatest concern. Those who don't have anywhere to stay. Now let us look at what have been the efforts in the Darfur before the passing of the resolution that now created the United Nations mission in the Sudan. Initially, the African Union also sent a peacekeeping force into the Darfur in May 2004. They had a mandate to monitor the humanitarian ceasefire agreement between the warring factions. Currently, the Sudanese government has bowed to a lot of pressure from the international community. Initially, they didn't allow the deployment of troops into Darfur because they believed that the atrocities that were committed there will be unearthed if the United Nations were to go into the Darfur. As a result of a lot of pressure from the international community, they have now agreed that the United Nations should go into the Darfur and provide some form of security. So we had a resolution 1769 passed by the Security Council, which authorized the deployment of 26,000 troops and police by end of December 2000 into Darfur. This mandate, or these troops going to Darfur, comes under a special charter of a special clause of the United Nations Charter, that is Chapter 7 of the Charter. The Chapter 7 allows the United Nations to use force to protect civilians. Under other charters, for example, Chapter 6, you are not allowed to use force. You only use force when you are under threat or in return to the use of force. But under Chapter 7, we can now use force to protect civilians. So the core mandate is to protect civilians in the Darfur. So this basically forms the mandate for the new force that will move into the Darfur. The core mandate is the protection of civilians and to allow for humanitarian assistance to be carried out across the region. But as I bring you the gist of what has developed in the Darfur so far, what has been my major concern, or what has been the major concern of the United Nations. We're so much concerned about the number of displaced persons, over 2 million people, and the challenge of delivering humanitarian relief to these displaced persons. The United Nations, as I said earlier on, considers Darfur to be one of the world's worst humanitarian crises. So what would be the root causes of the challenge? The first thing I'll mention is security. And this is where the slides that will come in now, I'll say are not too palatable. This is a very close friend of mine. It's called Naval Captain Tony Bozi. I was here in April. I went back to Darfur the same month, 2 months later, in July. 3 months later, he was shot and killed, and his vehicle carjacked. The rebels really need a lot of movement for their operations. So the United Nations vehicles are a lot of targets. You know, if you are in a vehicle and you are not very careful, you can be killed and your vehicle taken. This is just to bring to your notice, some of the challenges that are faced by people who work in the field and try to bring peace and security to our dear ones who are stricken with conflicts all around the globe. We have militia without any identifiable chain of command. If, for example, there's a rebel who you have a problem with, they don't answer to any identifiable chain of command. He can take a decision at this level. He doesn't need to answer to the next person at the next level. So it's difficult to, relate it to get to the command and be able to lay your complaint. For example, carjackings, as I showed, rose 65% in the first half of this year as compared to 2006. A lot of aid workers have been attacked, and they had needed to move out of their locations. 55 convoys had been attacked or looted, and 81 humanitarian vehicles have been hijacked. And there has been a lot of relocation of these aid or humanitarian agencies to try to relocate and move away from this security threat. We have political concerns as well, which have also brought up challenges to delivering humanitarian relief to the needy ones. The government has always, like I said, interfered in our moving relief items into the region. That is politically to try to frustrate the work of the UN and as well as other agencies. The terrain, the Darfur or Sudan, most part of Sudan is arid. It has a lot of undeveloped infrastructure. It's very difficult to move around. We have long droughts, and when the rains come, they create a lot of floods. This is a picture of the desert. And then the major mode of transport is the donkey, which is very slow. These were vehicles that we were trying to get to another location in Sudan. After the rains, May, June, most of the bridges were broken. It's difficult to get relief items across. One of the United Nations warehouses, the vehicles can get stuck in days without getting the goods released. We have a very harsh weather in Sudan. The produce deteriorate very fast, and deliveries are not on time. When the rains come, they are very heavy, and we had, this year, 3.5 million people were displaced as a result of the rains alone. There were a lot of floods in Sudan this year. I'm sure you heard that on the news. Most of the relief items get deteriorated before they even get to the warehouses. We have a lot of sandstorms, and when there's a sandstorm in Sudan, no air or land movement. You cannot see just maybe 1 foot ahead of you. You cannot move, and the aircrafts can also fly. These are sandstorms in Sudan. Even this is in Khartoum. You can imagine what will happen in the desert. Very, very serious when these things are happening. There are other obstacles to the humanitarian effort. We have mines. As I said, there are a lot of mines that have been laid in the region. And these mines maim a lot of people. A lot of humanitarian workers are not very free, or they are not comfortable in working around these areas where we have a lot of mines. A lot of logistic professionals do not like to go into the Sudanese region because they believe that it's a very harsh environment. The retention level in the United Nations mission in Sudan is very, very low. We have more people leaving than the number of people who are recruited. All these effects increase the cost of logistics. And then, of course, humanitarian aid from donors, not sufficient. We had $60 million that were pledged. Up to now, it's only $350 million that have been committed or obligated so far. Of course, the donors are also fatigued. This conflict has protracted for so long, and after donating for so long, people get fatigued, and they think that they are done enough, and they need to stop. What have been the efforts at trying to get around these challenges? Of course, the agencies continue to negotiate relief convoys. Maybe with luck, they are able to get some, protection forces that move with the convoys to protect them. Now, the AMIS force, the African Union force that was deployed initially, didn't have enough resources, the equipment, the finances, and other things to be able to undertake the task. That was why a lot of nations were calling for the United Nations involvement in the conflict, because the African Union, of course, most of African countries didn't have enough finances to be able to invest into this kind of task in the Darfur. So the force has been plagued with a lot of incapacitations, and that they didn't have enough resources to be able to carry out the task that was given to them. It was realized that the African Union mission in Sudan was really a failure. The UN has planned that it's going to spend about $650 million in aid to Darfur in this 2007. Although it's tough inside there, most of the humanitarian workers are also trying to deploy with their concerns over security having been alleviated. They think that they can go in with protection. They expect that they can at least deliver the goods. So having looked at all these things from the genesis of the conflict and looking at the challenges that we face in trying to get humanitarian relief to the needy, how do we assess the situation in Darfur currently? Do we have hope, or do we predict doom in Darfur? Well, I'll try to tell you about what is currently taking place. The government is willing to play ball. There's been a lot of pressure, especially for the United States, from other international organizations, for the government to allow in the United Nations for them to provide security for humanitarian relief to be provided for the needy. Once they are playing ball, I think it's a good sign. Sudan used to be supported by China because the oil in Sudan is drilled by China. And because of economic gains, they've always, with China having a veto at the Security Council, they've always vetoed any harsh resolution that they think is going to affect their economic interest in the Sudan. So initially, they were not in agreement with all of the resolutions. But I think next year we have Olympic Games in China. China has also done its analysis and realized that if it doesn't take care, a lot of nations are going to boycott the Olympics. So they need also to cooperate in Sudan. So they are also cooperating now. The rebels, we used to have a lot of fronts for the rebels. Now recently they had a meeting that was in July in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, to try to present a united front so that they can state their grievances and then meet the government so that they can together find solutions to the problems. So once we have a united front for the rebels, it means command can be accountable for their actions. Now we have a new resolution, 1769, which has promised 26,000 more troops on ground. The question is, can they deploy by end of December 2007? Because that will be the benchmark. If they are able to deploy by December 2007, then that will be a good sign. That is, with peace and security, with more boots on ground, it means there's protection for the convoys and we can get relief items to the needy. The main challenge also has been water. There's no water in Darfur. To get to the water level, it's very, very difficult. So with the UN coming in now, we're going to facilitate a lot of multi-million contracts to try to locate water and then try to move this to the refugees as well as the displaced persons. And of course, the Great United Nations, the United States is committed to 27% of cost of operations in Darfur. So if this pledge is to come in, that will also be a very good sign. So is it hope or doom? We have a task, that's to deploy the headquarters of the new force in Darfur by end October. That is, if we deploy by end of October, that's the headquarters, not the whole total force. If even half of the 26,000 troops are on ground by end of December this year, then I believe we have hope. Otherwise, I still see doom for Darfur. So what would be my takeaway? As potential graduates or MBA students, there are so many communities out there that have been affected and continue to be affected by these kind of challenges. The unending conflicts all across the world. The precursors to these are more often than not poverty, greed, and neglect. What can we do? Can we also generate plans to break away from this vicious cycle of poverty? At the same time, whilst we're trying to help the needy, we can make little profits. It's always been said that the market at the bottom of the pyramid is really huge and with a lot of untapped potential. We will be ready at that time to help in our small way to alleviate the suffering of a lot of people in these conflict-stricken areas. Let us all think about this. I'll bring my talk to an end, but to open the floor for discussions, questions, or comments. Like we did it last time, there are a lot of things that we can talk about, but I don't think we might have enough time to be able to present the long lecture. But as you bring up questions as well as comments, together I think we can discuss whatever the challenges or whatever the hopes or dooms for Darfur can be.
What was your job? What's your job over there?
I manage contracts for the United Nations. I'm a contract management officer. Currently, I'm in charge of the fuel as well as the rations contracts. So basically trying to move rations to the troops in the field and then trying to ensure that the United Nations is mobile by ensuring provision of fuel and availability of fuel in the mission.
You remarked that there was doom unless
at least the headquarters had a task to deploy by the end of October. Now we have, like I said, this whole process of deploying Darfur was discussed in 3 phases. But I didn't have the time to discuss all the phases because the Sudanese government was getting a lot of problems. There was a lot of restriction in the deployment into the Darfur. The United Nations came into agreement with the Sudanese government to have the deployment in piecemeal. We have a light support package, heavy support package, and then the hybrid, that is the African Union and the United Nations. We currently have the life support package, which is there as a startup for the headquarters. Then we have the heavy support package, which is also building up numbers. We have currently about, for civilian personnel, let's say about 45 or 50 people there. But we already have the African Union mission in Darfur, which is a size of about 7,000 troops. So when we finally move in, the 7,000 troops will be re-helmeted. They will change from the African Union into the blue helmet, and then will be beefed up from 7,000 to 26,000. We hope that these 26,000 will come in fully by the middle of next year. But at least if we have about half of them on ground, I think it will be very, very necessary and very helpful to get relief to the needy.
Well, thank you very much.
Question?
Are you in Sudan as a civilian or still under the Ghana police uniform?
No, I'm currently in Sudan as a civilian. I'm no more with the Ghanaian forces. I've been recruited by the United Nations in a position as a contract management officer, but not as a military officer anymore. I used to work for the Ghanaian forces, but no more.
How safe do you feel over there?
In Khartoum, it's okay. It's okay, although you don't still feel too safe because in a conflict zone, anything can happen. But out there in the field, it's very, very challenging. And even if you're in headquarters, like a contract management officer, every week you need to go into the field to ensure that the contracts are running as stipulated. But it's not very safe out there in the field, but it's quite safe in Khartoum because that's where the government is, and that is where a lot of development has taken place so far. So they have a lot of structures in place to provide security. As an international worker, you don't feel too safe, but we've not had any problem so far.
Did you play a part in the Rwanda? What happened in Rwanda when you were there?
Well, I was working for the Ghanaian forces in Rwanda, and I was part of those. Most of the nations withdrew after the crisis where a lot of people were slaughtered. And the Ghana government decided that we should stay, the Ghanaian troops should stay. So we were there to provide security for those who were taking shelter in the stadium called Amahuru. Amahuru in the Rwandese language means peace. So that was a stadium of peace. Meanwhile, there was no peace in that stadium. So I was part of the contingent that were providing security. I was a commander with about 102 people, and we were caught up in that stadium. But we looked at the humanitarian crisis that was evolving, as well as providing security for these people who didn't have anywhere to go or nobody to tend to. And we were there, we needed to do the task, and we performed it.
How long were you in the stadium?
In the stadium, we were there for about 2 months. Yeah.
Is southern secession a good idea or a bad idea?
I'll say again, please.
Is the South seceding a good idea or a bad idea?
That is a good question. I think most of us have not been able to answer that question. The people of Sudan, the people of Southern Sudan will not like to have anything to do with the people of the Northern Sudan. But what about the politicians? They believe that they have a lot of things to gain by trying to still stay with the North. But because of the past experiences with the North, the people themselves want to secede. But I believe that the politicians look at the benefits that will come out of trying to stay with the North, that oil can be shared by all. But if they secede, there's going to be a problem of how to divide, because they've already tried to redraw the border lines. Because the North now have the clout, they have a lot of power to be able to draw the lines as to whether the oil falls within the South or the oil falls within the North. So if they are to secede, are they going to secede with the oil, or they are going to leave part of the oil? That will be the question to answer. But the people themselves don't want to stay with the North, but the politicians would like to stay with the North.
One more question.
Could you give us an example or give us some kind of an idea of what a business plan might look like to help the situation?
Last night I was thinking about because I was going to ask that question, what can we do? So I said, what do you also suggest? And I look at a condo, by Darfur standards. I mean, people don't have a lot of places to stay. Darfur is a very vast place without any shelter. I mean, there are a lot of ways to go into affordable real estate that can be afforded, giving the people the opportunity to be able to own their own homes, not very expensive homes, using affordable material right there in Darfur to create this kind of environment. I think that real estate, affordable real estate at that will be one of the big areas to go into.
Thank you again.
Okay, thank you all very much for coming. I will see you again.